no. It's Crystal Skull. And this is Movie Night! Welcome to the show. I'm Jonathan Paula. Tonight's episode is one I've delayed or rescheduled at least a dozen times over the past few years. And I think that's because these films mean so much to me, I wanted to make sure my reviews did them justice. But as fate would have it, my procrastination actually paid off, as it was announced just this week that a fifth Indiana Jones movie will happen in 2019. And although some will argue the franchise already had one picture too many, there's no denying how incredibly entertaining they all are. We'll begin with the original entry, simply titled Raiders of the Lost Ark. Named by countless publications and popular polls as one of the greatest movies of all time, this action-adventure film from acclaimed director Steven Spielberg earned more than 21 times its $18 million budget following its release in the summer of 1981. With this near $400 million cume, Raiders ranks among the top 25 highest-grossing films ever made when adjusted for inflation. Besides its impressive commercial success, though, the picture was also praised by critics, scoring 9 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture, and it won for Best Art Direction, Film Editing, Sound, and Visual Effects, with a Special Achievement Award for Sound Effects Editing as well. Harrison Ford portrays Indiana Jones, a ruggedly handsome archaeology professor who embarks on dangerous quests to obtain rare artifacts. The whip-cracking, fedora-wearing hero is perhaps Ford's most iconic role, which, given his extensive filmography and near endless string of successes, is saying quite a lot. Conceived from writer George Lucas's desire to modernize the Saturday matinee serials of the 1930s and 40s, the 115-minute story sees Jones hired by the US government to track down the famed Ark of the Covenant before the Nazis can get a hold of it. It's a plain old good versus evil narrative, but the PG-rated film excels because of this simplicity. Ford imbues all of the trademark characteristics of the confident and invincible hero, and in fact he never once loses his hat during all the excitement. He portrays this iconic protagonist with humor, charm, fear, vulnerability, strength, anger, and faith to create a multifaceted character all audiences still love rooting for 35 years later. When pressed for details regarding an ambitious rescue plan, he simply barks, "I don't know, I'm making this up as I go." Although he'll be 75 years old when filming commences on the recently announced 5th installment, he's so perfectly cast in the role, I wouldn't have it any other way. As his romantic foil and ex-lover, Karen Allen holds her own and brings a great deal of warmth and purpose to the otherwise narrowly focused script. Their chemistry is contentious, flirtatious, and believable. Paul Freeman and Ronald Lacey are featured as the bad guys, and although they're generally uninteresting, they deliver just enough personality and threats to make their villainous personas stand out. Plus, the latter has one of the all-time coolest on-screen deaths in movie history. John Rhys Davies, Denholm Elliott, and Alfred Molina do marvelous work in supporting roles as allies and untrustworthy guides. The problem-solving, clue discovery, and character interactions in Raiders of the Lost Ark are all excellent and surprisingly entertaining, but obviously the real bread and butter are the action set pieces. Chief among them is a legendary cold open that famously ends with Ford outrunning a massive boulder he accidentally booby-trapped. Later, he chases after a Nazi caravan on horseback, knocks out a bunch of soldiers on board a truck, gets dragged beneath the wheels, and climbs back up to finish the job. The 6-minute sequence is pure, unadulterated fun. The classic components of what makes a great action movie boil down to its essential components. It may not be the biggest or most expensive scene, but its brilliant execution, careful pacing, impressive stunt work, incredible sound, and easy-to-follow choreography make it a textbook example of how to entertain. For my money, this self-contained chase may very well be the best scene in action movie history. Spielberg's direction throughout the movie is sharp and steadfast, using long takes and deep focus to show off the large sets and fantastic production design. A foray into the snake-infested Well of the Souls is photographed with tall shadows and warm firelight. Audio pioneer Ben Burtt's inventive work with Foley recordings gives the feature some incredible and convincing sound. A majority of the punches and body blows, in fact, were created by hitting a pile of leather jackets with a baseball bat. The visual effects are kept to a minimum until the picture's climax, where Industrial Light and Magic continues to impress by visualizing the intangible. From the playful whimsy of The Basket Game to the romantic and tender Marion's theme, John Williams' score is a true masterpiece. The titular Raiders March is one of the most recognizable pieces in cinematic music for a reason, a decidedly defiant and powerful anthem for a thrill-seeking hero. It also served as my ringtone for most of my mid-20s. The only real criticism I even have about this film is that our protagonist is largely inconsequential to the developments of the plot. Almost everything would have played out exactly the same with or without his involvement. Indiana Jones is ostensibly a bystander to his own movie. This nitpicking notwithstanding, the film has proven to be incredibly popular and wildly influential, spawning 3 sequels, a prequel, a television series, over a dozen video games, and plenty of merchandising. Even Indy's hat and jacket are on display at the Smithsonian Museum. It may not have any broad thematic message or emotional depth, but it's near-perfect filmmaking just the same. A believable and thrilling experience on every viewing. I simply cannot recommend this movie enough. In a career filled with Oscar victories and box office hits, Raiders of the Lost Ark remains Spielberg's magnum opus and the quintessential adventure film. Now let's see what you had to say about it. You use words like classic, best, and masterpiece, so it's no surprise everyone rated this a 10 out of 10. Now to its follow-up film, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. A different but no less entertaining experience. Director Steven Spielberg and writer George Lucas reunited for this $28 million action film, which grossed over $300 million in profit following its release in May of 1984. Adventure-seeking archaeologist Indiana Jones is tasked by a small village to retrieve a sacred stone from a dangerous cult deep in the catacombs of an ancient Indian palace. The plight of a small village is certainly a worthwhile crusade, but it simply isn't a very exciting or accessible story. Perhaps that's why this 118-minute feature is widely considered the worst entry of the original trilogy. Explaining his motivations for helping the locals retrieve a special rock, Indiana simply repeats, "Fortune and glory, kid. Fortune and glory." Harrison Ford returns to the role he was born to play, and is able to handle the humor and romance just as well as the fistfights and chases. His romantic interest and damsel in distress is played by Spielberg's future wife Kate Capshaw. Portraying a nightclub singer terrified of the creepy crawly creatures of the jungle, her fish-out-of-water performance honestly gets a bit irritating. Perpetually helpless, at least her distressed screams and adversarial chemistry with Ford help inject some much-needed levity into the screenplay. Young Vietnamese child actor Jonathan K. Kwan is excellent as Indy's eager little sidekick, and Short rounds out the group with great humor. Amrish Puri is frightening as a demonic thuggy priest who magically rips people's hearts out of their chests during sacrificial rituals. In an effort to explain away the absence of Karen Allen, Indy's love interest from the previous picture, Temple of Doom is actually a prequel, with the entire story taking place a year before the events of Part 1. It's a curious, almost unspoken production decision that amounts to little more than a neat bit of film trivia, as the movies never make reference to this mixed-up timeline. Thanks to its darker and more graphic imagery, namely the sacrificial sequence in the titular chamber, Temple of Doom is generally credited, along with Gremlins, which came out a few weeks later, with the creation of the PG-13 rating. At the time of release, however, the MPAA didn't have that option, making the second Indiana Jones film the most violent PG-rated movie ever made. Spielberg later admitted that he felt uncomfortable with certain scenes, and the darker-than-intended tone of the film was partially because Lucas was going through a divorce during production and was, quote, not in a good mood. Spielberg's cinematography is, as usual, impeccable, framing the attractive leads against exotic backgrounds of smoke, shadows, fire, and flames. The visuals here are mostly carried by the impressive production design and lavish costumes, but Dennis Muren and his team at ILM took home an Oscar for Best Visual Effects thanks to a thrilling minecart chase towards the end of the film. The precise editing of this sequence gives it a fantastic sense of speed and danger, while the aforementioned effects, which combine chroma key, projection screens, and matte paintings, make it all look completely believable. Expanding on the themes and leitmotifs of Raiders, John Williams contributes yet another Academy-nominated score, which is at its finest during an extremely tense scene that sees Ford and Kwan trapped in a deadly spike trap. It has heavier sounds mixed with high pitches and angrier pacing that provides the core mood of the film. Although it wasn't as critically or commercially successful as its predecessor, I have to applaud the filmmakers for at least attempting something different with this picture. So despite a smaller scope and more mature imagery, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom is still an exciting adventure with thrilling set pieces. Now let's read some of your YouTube reviews. A particularly divisive movie, your scores averaged to an 8, and I'm inclined to agree, this is a great film. For tonight's poll question, who's your favorite character in the Indiana Jones franchise, besides Indy himself? Leave your response as a comment below. Next up, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. A fantastic sequel that rivals the original. The at the time presumed final installment of the Indiana Jones franchise was released on Memorial Day weekend in 1989, where it scored $400 million in proceeds against its $55 million budget. Unlike Temple of Doom, this isn't some half-hearted prequel, but a true follow-up to the original picture, featuring callbacks and returning characters. The 2-hour and 7-minute film sees treasure hunter Indiana Jones following in his father's footsteps to find the Holy Grail before the Nazis can claim the artifact for themselves. Donning the fedora and whip for a third time, Harrison Ford once again illustrates why he's such a captivating and capable leading man. He portrays Jones as a reluctant hero who's forced to reconcile his beliefs with his doubts. Despite being only 12 years Ford's senior, Sean Connery is more than convincing as his father, and makes for a franchise-defining addition. Their relationship, filled with bickering and hesitant trust, feels like a real dysfunctional father-son dynamic, and more importantly, is hugely entertaining and often funny. Alison Doody portrays a beautiful but untrustworthy accomplice, while Julian Glover is excellent as the polite but uncompromising villain. An exciting cold open set in the Utah desert features River Phoenix as a teenage Indiana who squares off against a group of grave robbers. It's a fun prequel-like sequence that effectively serves as a proof of concept for the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles TV series that premiered a few years later. This opening chase also establishes a number of the character's now famous trademarks, working as great in-jokes for the fans. Departing some sage advice to our young hero, the fedora-wearing grave robber remarks, "You lost today, kid, but that doesn't mean you have to like it." In an effort to offset the more macabre tone of the second film, director Steven Spielberg opted to lighten up this movie with plenty of humor, both physical gags and amusing dialogue. The PG-13 rated film is definitely the funniest entry in the series as a result, and is markedly more enjoyable because of it. The entire film was a string of non-stop excitement, which includes a train chase, a boat chase, a motorcycle chase, an airplane chase, and finally a massive tank chase. The action and spectacle in this centerpiece tank sequence are ramped up even further, filled with dangerous stunts, big explosions, and last-minute rescues. The acclaimed director makes great use of his locations, like long unbroken crane shots inside a Venetian library to reveal a discovered clue, or low-angle shots as Indy stares out over an impossible precipice. John Williams' score is some of his best work, incorporating bellowing horns and sweeping strings into existing melodies for fabulous results. One of my all-time favorites growing up, I practically wore out my widescreen VHS copy of this while falling asleep to it on long summer nights. The picture's awesome climax that sees Indiana facing off against a series of faith-based challenges also compelled my friends and I to recreate our own version for a short film in college. We had a lot of fun with what was basically a scene-for-scene parody, and I remain particularly fond of Montana Young and the Search for the Monte Cristo today, which has been available on my YouTube channel here since we first uploaded it 10 years ago. No matter how many times I watch, there's not a single moment of this picture I don't enjoy. And although it's too derivative of Raiders to truly be called the better film, it honestly is. A funnier version of a familiar formula, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade is the ultimate adventure for all movie fans. Now let's see what you had to say about it. Unanimous praise was given to Ford and Connery's chemistry, as well as the action and humor. We both agree this is an amazing film. Now let's review Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Better than its reputation suggests, but not by much. Released on May 22, 2008, a full 19 years after the previous installment, this sci-fi adventure film still took home an impressive $786 million, making a solid $600 million in profit. The 119-minute story, directed once again by Steven Spielberg, sees adventurer and tenured professor of archaeology Indiana Jones entangled in a Soviet plot to uncover the secrets behind the titular artifacts. Keeping with tradition of the franchise, the PG-13 rated film is an homage to the B-movies of its depicted era. In this case, that genre is the campy science fiction serials of the 1950s. At 65 years old, Harrison Ford remains as spry and charming as ever, and thanks to a script that's acutely aware of his slightly limited abilities, his age honestly doesn't weaken the production in the slightest. If anything, his added crankiness and experience makes him a more interesting hero. He's older and wiser than his portrayal of the character in the 1980s. In short, playing up his old age was a great decision that resulted in plenty of amusing jokes. And as the character himself once eloquently defended, it's not the years, it's the mileage. Shia LaBeouf is the young, courageous, and vain sidekick who actually does a great job in the unfortunately thankless role. Sarcastically remarking on Jones's day job, he quips, "Oh, you're a teacher. Well, that's gonna be a big help." Their unwilling mentor-student relationship is a fitting role reversal from the father-son dynamic of Part 3. Karen Allen returns as Indy's old flame, and while she's perfectly warm and enjoyable in the familiar role, it feels more like fan service than organic storytelling. The usually talented Cate Blanchett turns in a somewhat stilted performance, who sounds like Barbara Walters faking a bad Russian accent. John Hurt, Ray Winstone, and Jim Broadbent round out the supporting cast with excellent performances, each bringing real personality to their much smaller parts. Unlike its predecessors, which all start with awesome cold opens, nothing really happens in the first 13 minutes of this movie, and when something exciting finally does occur, it culminates with Ford waking up in a Nuketown minutes before a test detonation, which sees the old professor hurriedly locking himself in a lead-lined fridge to survive the atomic blast. Much has been said about this ridiculous sequence, so often in fact that the phrase "nuke the fridge" is now synonymous with "jump the shark," a trope to denote when a franchise has finally gone too far into the absurd. However unbelievable this scene is though, and boy is it ever, I will say it's still pretty fun. Other individual moments help recapture the magic of this iconic series, like when Ford helps a student with some homework after him and LaBeouf come sliding under the tables of a library on a motorcycle mid-chase. A nighttime grave robbing excursion is beautifully shot and rather interesting, but our characters don't have a deadline or any real threat pushing them forward. It's a minor but embarrassing scriptwriting mistake for a franchise that usually doesn't make any.
Well, start your poison! Stay there.
You're a teacher?
Part-time.
Later, there's an unbelievable sword fight atop two speeding jeeps through the jungle, and after that, Shia is swinging through the treetops alongside a horde of wild monkeys to catch back up with his group. The absurdity of this scene notwithstanding, the visual effects from Industrial Light and Magic are hardly up to their usual standards. There's a few nice references to earlier films along the way, especially the inaugural installment, but all the pandering to yesteryear won't mask the missteps of today. And sadly, there are a few big ones here, namely the central MacGuffin of the story, the Crystal Skulls. Spoiler talk ahead. The older installments had fantastical elements too, but they were based on historical mythology and religion, whereas the quest here revolves around some hocus-pocus interdimensional space aliens whose detached skulls contain magnetic psychokinetic brainwashing powers. Having said that, given the magical context of the earlier films and the borrowed themes and styles of 1950s cinema, Indiana Jones discovering aliens is hardly a surprise, let alone a problem, but the goofy tone and CGI-heavy visuals certainly are. Dueling leitmotifs and competing octaves is a neat twist on recycled themes, but ultimately there are no standout tracks on John Williams' new soundtrack. Indeed, this is the only film in the series not to receive a nomination for Best Original Score. In fact, the movie wasn't nominated for anything. Fans of the franchise will probably enjoy seeing these old characters again, but its broader appeal is limited. Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull definitely isn't a bad movie, it's just a bad Indiana Jones movie. Now let's see what you had to say about it. While some were willing to defend this picture, most didn't, and your scores averaged to an alright. Despite its flaws, I had a good time with this movie, so I'm scoring it accordingly. Let's wrap up with some final thoughts on the series. Despite fleeting glimpses of quality entertainment, the fourth installment was largely seen as a disappointment. Perhaps the upcoming fifth entry, not due in theaters until 2019, will offer redemption for the aging franchise. The announcement that Harrison Ford and Steven Spielberg would be dusting off that bullwhip to reunite for another Indiana Jones picture was a welcome surprise this week, and for the relevancy of my reviews, could not have come at a better time. Ford will be pushing 76 when they film this next chapter, but I for one am cautiously optimistic. If The Force Awakens is any indication, age clearly isn't a factor for him. Speaking of Star Wars, George Lucas has been the butt of many jokes since he did the prequel trilogy, but I'm honestly a bit disappointed he won't be involved for this next Indiana Jones film. But regardless of who authors it, with the right script, I believe there can be a compelling story to tell with this geriatric hero. Think Sylvester Stallone and Rocky Balboa. Shia LaBeouf wasn't a fan favorite in Crystal Skull, but now that he's part of established canon, I think excluding him from the next movie would be a mistake. But what will Indy be searching for this time? Who will be his adversaries? Obviously it'll have to take place sometime in the late 1960s, so maybe hippies or the space race are involved? Your guess is as good as mine. We've got 3 full years before we find out if this is a great idea or an awful one though, so until then leave your thoughts and predictions on the upcoming 5th film in the comments below. I'm interested to hear what you think. Unfortunately that does it for tonight's episode, but here's what we'll be discussing next time if you'd like to leave a comment review. And please click this information icon to watch some related content. Once again, my name is Jonathan Paula, thank you for watching, and have a good movie night.